Imagine a religious text that that flat out refuses your blind faith.
Right.
Like a text that essentially looks at you and says, if you don't audit these laws with your own critical intellect, well, you are failing the universe.
Yeah, which is not what you expect at all.
Not at all. I mean, today we're doing a deep dive into a source that just tears down almost everything we assume about theology, human nature, and, well, how societies are supposed to function.
It is a totally radical departure from the norm.
Mm.
We're dealing with an in-depth philosophical lecture here, and it was delivered back in September 1970.
Okay.
It's an exegesis. So, a critical line-by-line analysis of Chapter 10 of the Quran, which is known as Surah Yunus.
Mm.
And the speaker in this source, well, they approach the material in a way that feels incredibly modern, like almost surgical, really.
Surgical is a great way to put it. I mean, the mission for this deep dive is to really pull apart this radically different framework for human nature that the lecture presents. Because we are going to explore why the text warns so aggressively against two major philosophical extremes, which honestly are still heavily debated today.
Oh, absolutely.
On one side, you've got pure materialism, and on the other, you have ascetic escapism, basically running away from the world entirely.
Yeah.
But the true core of this entire discussion, like the thematic engine driving the source material, is what we were going to call the protocol.
The protocol of intellectual verification. It is the absolute non-negotiable requirement that human beings must use their rational minds to verify what they're told.
Right.
And actually, especially when it comes to divine claims.
So if you're listening right now, whether your background is in sociology, economics, psychology, or you're just intensely curious about the architecture of human civilization, this deep dive is going to give you a really fascinating mental model.
It definitely will.
Because the lecture we are analyzing, it attempts to map out the exact balance between material progress and human values.
Yeah, and to really grasp the gravity of what the speaker is proposing. I mean, we have to situate ourselves in September 1970.
Right, the historical context.
Exactly. The historical context here is vital, even though, the text itself is analyzing ancient scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the global climate at that specific moment.
Okay, so Cold War.
The Cold War is at its absolute peak. The world is ideologically cleaved in two. You have the Western Bloc, heavily leaning into capitalist consumerism, rapid technological expansion, material accumulation.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have the Soviet bloc, which is built on dialectical materialism.
Right.
The idea that human history is entirely driven by physical economic forces, coupled with a state-enforced atheism.
So both of these dominant global superpowers were, in their own unique ways, just deeply anchored in materialism.
Exactly.
I mean, they were arguing over the distribution of resources, sure, but they fundamentally agreed that the physical world was the ultimate, like the only battleground.
Precisely. And into that incredibly polarized atmosphere comes this lecture. The speaker isn't treating the Quran as a collection of mystical chants or private rituals for personal comfort.
Right, it's not a self-help book.
No, not at all. The lecture approaches the text as a comprehensive, highly technical blueprint for social economics, political science, and honestly, the psychological health of a civilization.
Wow.
The speaker is essentially standing between these massive global ideologies and arguing that, well, both of them have fundamentally misidentified what a human being actually is.
Which is where we have to start, I think. Before we can dig into the rules for building a functional society, we have to figure out how this framework even defines the operator.
Yeah.
Like, what is the human baseline according to this 1970 lecture? And to make its point, the source contrasts its view with two of the most dominant philosophies in human history.
Right. So the first philosophy the lecture challenges is a deeply ingrained theological concept, the idea of original sin. The text references traditional Christian theology here to illustrate this point. Specifically, the doctrine that human nature is inherently flawed, broken, or sinful right from the moment of birth.
Like the idea that you just come off the assembly line with a fatal defect.
Exactly. And, we should clarify for the listener, we are just imparting the source materials and analysis here. We aren't taking theological or political sides.
Right, of course. We're just looking at the framework.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the lecture argues that adopting this premise that humanity is intrinsically a manifestation of evil or fundamentally flawed, it completely destroys the concept of human agency.
How so?
Well, the speaker's logic is pretty straightforward. If an individual is forced by their very nature to be sinful, then punishing them for acting out that nature defies basic justice.
It would be like punishing a fish for being wet. If
Exactly.
it's your inherent state, you don't have a choice in the matter.
Right. The Force suggests that this specific theological philosophy paints humanity into a corner of inevitable failure. It creates this paradigm where humanity is constantly apologizing for its own existence,
Mm-hmm.
requiring constant external mediation just to be considered, acceptable.
Yeah.
The lecture fundamentally rejects this, arguing that the human slate is not inherently stained with evil.
So that is extreme number one, the belief that humans are born bad. But the lecture immediately pivots, right, to tackle the other massive philosophical heavyweight, which is the purely biological materialist view.
Yes.
This is the perspective that says humans are really nothing more than highly evolved primates. There is no spiritual layer. We are simply chemistry and biology.
And it's important to know the lecture actually acknowledges the reality of biology here. It doesn't deny science.
Okay, yeah.
It plainly states that biology dictates our core instincts, summarizing them as the basic demands of physical life. So self-preservation, self-assertion, or aggression to protect territory and reproduction.
Right. Survival, dominance, and the continuation of the species.
Exactly.
So let me push back on the lecture's framing here for a second. Because from an evolutionary biology standpoint, thinking about concepts like the selfish gene, those biological drives are incredibly efficient.
Well, they are.
Survival of the fittest doesn't care about philosophy. It just cares about what works to keep the organism alive. So why does the lecture view this purely biological baseline as, well, insufficient?
Well, the speaker doesn't view it as insufficient for an animal. That's the key.
Oh, okay.
The critical argument raised in the source is that if humans operate solely on these biological instincts, they are entirely captive to physical laws.
Right.
If your entire existence is dedicated to preserving your own life, dominating competitors to ensure your comfort, and passing on your genetics, you are functionally indistinguishable from any other mammal. You are just a biological machine executing an evolutionary script.
So we're just meat computers running a survival program.
Exactly. And so the lecture introduces a differentiator to break us out of that script.
Mm-hmm.
It brings in the concept of values. Right. Higher order concepts like proportional justice, equity, moral right versus wrong. The source argues that the capacity to uphold these values, even at the expense of biological drives, is the singular factor that elevates an organism from animal to human.
Okay, to ground this for you listening, let's talk about the analogy the speaker uses because it's incredibly effective. The lecture asks the audience to just observe a cow grazing in a pasture.
Right, the cow analogy.
This cow experiences hunger, which is a biological demand. To satisfy that physical necessity, it eats the grass.
But the cow operates completely outside the realm of values.
Completely. I mean, the cow possesses zero concept of property rights or borders or equity.
Right.
If there is a patch of more nutritious grass just across a fence in a neighboring farmer's field, the cow will simply lean over and consume it.
It doesn't experience a moral dilemma.
Yeah.
It doesn't, stop to consider the labor the neighboring farmer put into growing that grass.
It lacks the value of ownership. It just has hunger.
Precisely. The cow is flawlessly fulfilling its physical necessity. And the lecture uses this to define the pure animalistic state. It's the fulfillment of biological needs without the restriction or guidance of higher values.
So if we translate that cow analogy into human terms, it's kind of like, let's say I'm programming an artificial intelligence. If I give that AI a single core directive like, ensure your own survival and gather resources, and I don't give it any overriding ethical constraints, that AI is going to act exactly like the cow.
Right, absolutely.
It will consume whatever server space, energy, or data it needs to fulfill its goal, regardless of the damage it does to other systems.
That is a perfect modern parallel to the lecture's argument, yeah. The unconstrained AI is operating purely on its programmed biological drive, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this leads the lecture to introduce a framework that we can call the 1/10 versus 9/10 rule.
Okay, break that down.
The speaker posits that our biological existence, the absolute necessity to secure food, shelter, survival, that represents only a fraction of our potential. The lecture uses the fraction of 1/10.
Wait, so if I live my entire life just trying to make money to buy food, secure a house, protect my family, which honestly sounds like a standard, respectable life to most of us.
Yeah.
The lecture is arguing that I am only operating at 10% capacity?
Basically, yes. The source argues that you are fulfilling the prerequisite for human life, but you haven't actually engaged the human part yet.
Wow.
The other 9/10 of the equation represent the capacity for those higher values we mentioned. establishing justice, protecting the vulnerable, creating societal balance.
Right.
If a society or an individual structures their entire existence around just fulfilling that one-tenth biological need, they're voluntarily downgrading their operational status to an animal baseline.
So if I see someone drop a $100 bill, my 1/10 biological drive says, take it. That increases your resources and your survivability. But my 9/10 human value system says, that isn't yours. Keeping it disrupts the balance of justice.
Exactly.
If I take the money, the lecture implies I am functionally operating as a highly sophisticated cow.
The text uses the specific phrase, the animal in man. It stresses that fulfilling biological needs is a non-negotiable reality of physical existence. We have to eat.
Sure.
But the critical distinction, the actual threshold of humanity, is how those needs are fulfilled. Are they fulfilled in accordance with higher values, or purely through the path of least resistance and maximum biological gain?
That sets up a really stark baseline.
Ah.
But what's fascinating is that the lecture doesn't stop at calling us animals.
No, it goes further.
It introduces this caveat that significantly escalates the danger of this mindset. Because the source text argues that when a human being abandons values, they don't just revert to an animal state. They actually become tangibly worse than animals.
Yeah, and this leads us into a deep psychological critique presented in the lecture. The speaker cites a specific verse from the Quran that describes humans who reject higher guidance. The translation provided is that they become like cattle, nay, more astray.
More astray. Why would a human acting on biological instinct be more lost or, more dangerous than a literal animal doing the exact same thing?
The lecture points to a biological safeguard that animals possess, but humans lack.
Okay.
And that is the physiological off switch. Let's go back to the cow in the field for a second. The cow feels hunger, it consumes grass, and once its stomachs are full, a biological signal triggers satiation. The cow stops eating, it lies down and rests.
Right. It doesn't look around the field and start panicking about all the grass it hasn't eaten yet.
It doesn't decide to build a massive silo to hoard the rest of the pasture, just in case. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't deprive the other cattle of their food. Its drive is intrinsically and permanently tethered to its immediate physical necessity. Once the necessity is met, the drive deactivates.
But humans don't have that off switch. And the lecture argues that human psychology features this really dangerous malfunction in this area.
Yeah.
The source introduces an Arabic term here that is central to its critique of human economics. Takathur. It roughly translates to endless accumulation or amassing, or the drive to multiply wealth. The speaker in the lecture identifies this as a psychological mutation where the human instinct for self-preservation detaches entirely from physical necessity.
I think about this kind of like a broken mechanic in a video game.
How so?
Imagine playing a role-playing game where the whole point is to gather enough gold to buy the ultimate armor and defeat the final boss.
Okay.
But imagine a player who has already beaten the game, they already have the best armor, but they just keep running around the starting area, crushing low-level enemies for pennies, hoarding millions of gold coins they can never possibly spend.
Yeah.
The original goal has been completely lost, and the accumulation has just become this mindless, infinite loop. That captures the essence of Takathur perfectly. Because the lecture points out that a person with millions of dollars wants to acquire hundreds of millions.
All right.
Not because their biological needs require it. I mean, they cannot consume 1,000,000 times more calories, nor can they sleep in 1,000 beds simultaneously. Their physical needs were met a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
Yet they're driven by this insatiable, malfunctioning hunger to step ahead of their peers, to hoard, and to accumulate purely for the sake of the accumulation itself.
It notes that an individual suffering from this malfunction could amass a literal mountain of wealth and immediately desire a second mountain. A person who is genuinely starving will eat a loaf of bread and feel immense satisfaction and peace.
Exactly.
But a person driven by Takathur could control global industries and still feel this deep foundational anxiety that they just don't have enough.
And this infinite loop is exactly why the source argues that an unguided human is more astray than cattle. A satisfied animal is inert. It's harmless. But a human whose survival instinct has mutated into Takathur is endlessly dangerous because their appetite recognizes zero boundaries.
The lecture uses an incredibly vivid, almost visceral analogy to drive this home. It asks the audience to imagine a scenario. So to you listening, imagine you are walking down a long, isolated road at night.
Okay.
You glance over your shoulder and you see a massive bull walking a few yards behind you.
I mean, most people would feel a surge of caution, certainly.
Sure, but you wouldn't necessarily be paralyzed by terror because you intuitively understand the parameters of the animal's behavior.
Right.
It's likely moving toward water or barn or looking for food. It operates within a predictable biological framework.
It has an off switch.
Exactly. But the lecture then changes the scenario. Imagine you look over your shoulder on that dark, lonely road, and there is an unknown human being walking behind you in silence.
Yeah, the psychological reaction to that is entirely different. It triggers a profound primal dread.
Exactly. Why does a member of our own species evoke more terror than a 1,000-pound beast?
It's a great question.
The lecture suggests it's because we subconsciously recognize that a human being unmoored from values is infinitely more unpredictable and dangerous than a wild animal. You have no way of knowing if their malfunction of accumulation is active. You don't know what they might want to take from you because their desires are not capped by a full stomach.
That's chilling. And if we zoom out from the individual level and look at macroeconomics, which the speaker in the 1970 lecture was intensely focused on, the implications of Takathur are staggering.
Absolutely.
The lecture really invites a critique of how global systems operate. Just think about the pursuit of infinite, quarter-over-quarter corporate growth on a planet with finite resources.
The speaker in the text frames the dominant economic models as essentially institutionalizing this exact malfunction. What modern society often champions as, ambition or drive or growth, this theological framework diagnoses as a catastrophic psychological glitch.
The lecture argues that when industries optimize purely for maximum profit extraction, often at the direct expense of ecological stability or the well-being of the labor force, this isn't merely a policy failure.
Right.
The source frames it as the symptom of a species that has willfully suppressed its 9/10 human values and allowed its 1/10 biological drive to metastasize into an infinite hunger.
It's a really sobering lens through which to view human progress. I mean, we've built these towering civilizations, but the lecture is basically asking, are we just highly organized cattle with a hoarding problem?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the most crucial pivot of the text. If human nature defaults to this destructive loop of Takathur, how is it corrected? Like, what is the mechanism for fixing the glitch?
And this introduces the core thematic anchor of our deep dive, the protocol.
Here we go.
If the inherent problem is our propensity to slip into infinite accumulation, the solution proposed by the lecture is the mandatory, rigorous application of human intellect to verify and enforce values.
This goes right back to our opening hook. Because the lecture is loud and explicit in its rejection of blind faith. It actively dismantles the notion that religious devotion means turning off your critical faculties.
Exactly.
The speaker argues that you cannot simply inherit your worldview. You cannot accept a societal structure or a religious dogma just because your ancestors practiced it or because some charismatic leader dictates it.
Right. And to illustrate this protocol of intellect, the lecture dives into a detailed analysis of a metaphor found in Surah 10, verse 24.
Okay.
The metaphor is designed to expose the fragility and illusion of a life built exclusively on material accumulation.
Walk us through the imagery the verse uses, because it's very striking.
So the verse asks the reader to imagine heavy rain falling upon the earth. The soil absorbs this water, and the result is an explosion of lush, vibrant crops. The vegetation grows thick and intertwined.
Right.
And the owner of this agricultural empire surveys his land and feels an overwhelming sense of mastery. He believes he has secured his future, conquered the elements, and achieved absolute material stability.
He looks at his bank account, his stock portfolio, his massive silo of grain, and thinks, I am untouchable.
Exactly. But then the verse describes a sudden, catastrophic intervention, a storm or disaster that strikes by night or by day. And in an instant, the entire crop is decimated.
Wow.
The land is wiped clean, as if absolutely nothing had been planted there the day before.
It is the ultimate rug pull. A brutal reality check on the permanence of physical wealth.
It demonstrates the vulnerability of relying entirely on systems that are inherently transient. You can build a fortress of wealth, but if it exists only in the material dimension, it is incredibly fragile.
Right.
However, the speaker in the lecture emphasizes that the most vital part of this verse isn't the warning about the disaster.
Oh, really?
No, it's the specific phrasing used to conclude the metaphor.
Okay. This is where the protocol is activated.
Exactly. The lecture points out a recurring pattern in the text. Whenever the text presents these complex parables or socioeconomic metaphors, it almost always concludes with a phrase like, thus do we detail the signs for people who reflect, or for a people who use their intellect.
Interesting.
The speaker highlights two specific Arabic terms used in the original text, Aql and Yatafakkarun.
Let's break those down. So, Aql generally translates to intellect, reason, or rationality, and Yatafakkarun refers to the act of deep reflection, pondering, or basically critical thinking.
The lecture extracts a massive foundational theological argument from this. It asserts that the application of Aql, your consciousness, your logical reasoning, is not just a helpful tool, it is a mandatory prerequisite for interacting with divine guidance.
Wait, so the source is saying that if you don't engage your intellect, you are actually barred from understanding the message?
Yes. The text argues that divine values are not designed for individuals who seek the comfort of blind obedience.
Wow.
They are engineered specifically for people who are capable of observing cause and effect, analyzing sociological trends, and applying rigorous critical thought to their environment.
I want to pause here for a second because the implications of this are staggering. We're so conditioned to view faith and reason as opposing forces.
Very true.
The classic definition of faith for many people is, belief in the absence of evidence. We are often taught that questioning sacred texts is a sign of weakness or even heresy, but this 1970 lecture is looking at the Quran and claiming that the text itself is demanding a peer review from the human mind.
It is a demand for an intellectual audit. The speaker reiterates that if a concept is presented to you as a divine law, a societal rule, or a moral imperative, you are required to process it through your own logical faculties.
Right.
You have to ask, does this rule practically lead to human flourishing? Does it create equity? Or does it lead to tyranny, exploitation, and Takathur?
It's as if the creator of the universe open-sourced the code for human society and said, here is the blueprint. I expect you to run the simulations, audit the code, and mathematically verify that it works.
Which fundamentally alters the relationship between humanity and authority. If the primary requirement for engaging with truth is your own intellect, well, it completely removes the excuse of ignorance.
You can't just shrug and say, well, the priest told me to do it, or that's how the economy has always worked.
Exactly. Your intellect is the specific instrument you are issued to diagnose truth from falsehood. If you refuse to use it, you are culpable for the systems you help perpetuate.
So the protocol demands that we use our intellect. Let's test that. Let's do exactly what the lecture asks and apply our rational minds to audit the two massive societal extremes that the speaker heavily criticizes. If we run them through the protocol of Aqwa, why do these come and pass fail?
The first extreme the lecture analyzes is pure materialism. This is the secular worldview we discussed earlier, the belief that the physical universe is a closed loop with no spiritual continuity or higher metaphysical values.
This is the philosophy that says, you are born, you get an education, you enter the workforce, you try to accumulate enough resources to be comfortable, you retire, and then your consciousness is just extinguished.
The lecture argues that if a society accepts this purely physical timeline as its absolute reality, the logical and unavoidable mathematical outcome is Takathur.
Okay, walk me through that math.
Well, if this brief biological window is the entirety of existence, then the most rational action an individual can take is to hoard as much comfort, status, and physical wealth as possible before the clock runs out.
I see. Let's test that logic with an example. If I am playing a game of Monopoly and I know the game definitively ends in exactly 20 minutes, and there are absolutely no consequences after the box is closed, what is my incentive to be generous?
Right, there isn't one.
Why would I forgive someone's rent? My only logical objective is to extract maximum capital from the other players to ensure my own victory condition in that 20-minute window.
And that is exactly what the intellect verifies. The lecture argues that pure materialism inherently disincentivizes self-sacrifice or long-term multi-generational equity.
Yeah.
It creates a hyper-competitive environment that accelerates hoarding, which inevitably results in massive wealth disparities, social fracturing, and the eventual collapse of the society under its own top-heavy weight. Therefore, pure materialism fails the intellectual audit.
Okay, so pure materialism leads to the hoarding malfunction. It fails. What is the second extreme the lecture audits?
The second extreme is asceticism, or monasticism. The lecture uses the Arabic term Rabbaniyat.
Rabbaniyat.
Yes. This refers to the historical path taken by numerous traditions. The text explicitly calls out certain practices of Hindu yogis, Christian monastic orders, and specific streams of Sufi mysticism. These groups observed the corruption of the material world, they saw the brutality of Takathur, and they concluded that the material world itself was inherently evil.
And so their solution was to basically opt out.
Precisely.
They declare the human body a trap, physical desires as impure, and human society as a lost cause. So to achieve spiritual purity, they retreat. They move into a monastery, they sit in a cave in the mountains, they wear coarse clothing, and they drastically limit their caloric intake to punish their biological drives.
Right, and what is truly fascinating about the lecture is the sheer intensity with which it rejects this ascetic approach. The speaker systematically dismantles the idea that running away from the world equates to holiness.
I can see you listening being a bit confused by this because on the surface, a monk meditating in a cave isn't hurting anyone.
True.
They aren't exploiting workers, they aren't hoarding wealth, they have effectively cured themselves of Takathur by just refusing to participate in the economy. So why does the lecturer view this with such hostility?
Because, as the text argues, running away from a burning building doesn't put out the fire. It just ensures the building burns down. The lecturer posits that treating the world as a prison is a massive evasion of human responsibility. The framework of the text refuses to divide reality into a clean binary of spiritual versus material.
By abandoning the material world to preserve your own personal sense of purity, you are effectively leaving all the resources, all the technology, and all the levers of political power exclusively in the hands of the materialists who are going to use them to exploit the vulnerable.
You are surrendering the battlefield without a fight. And to drive this point home, the speaker in the 1970 lecture references a phenomenal piece of literature.
Oh, this is so good.
It's a poem by Allama G.A, a highly influential philosopher and poet. The poem is titled Satan's Parliament, or Iblis ki Majlis-e Shura.
This reference is an absolute masterclass in political and psychological framing. Let's spend some time unpacking this poem because it perfectly crystallizes the lecture's critique of escapism.
Yeah, let's do it. So the poem sets a scene where Satan is holding a summit with his cabinet of advisors. These ministers are presenting reports on their efforts to corrupt and destroy humanity.
And the ministers are just boasting about the massive destructive systems they have engineered. Like one minister steps up and points to fascism, bragging about the immense bloodshed and authoritarian cruelty it has unleashed.
Right.
Another minister highlights imperialism and capitalism, boasting about how these systems have structurally enslaved millions, forcing them to labor endlessly just to survive while a few hoard the wealth.
And the ministers are incredibly proud of these aggressive, materialist systems of oppression. They believe they have won the war for humanity's soul through sheer brutal force and economic exploitation.
Yeah.
But Satan listens to them and essentially dismisses their efforts as amateur. He tells his cabinet that they are thinking too small.
Right. Satan looks at his ministers and says, "My ultimate weapon, the absolute masterpiece of my strategy against humanity, isn't political tyranny. It is escapist religion."
Satan explains to his parliament that his most devastating geopolitical strategy is convincing the inherently good, spiritually inclined people that the material world is dirty and beneath them.
Unbelievable.
He wants the moral people to become entirely consumed with complex theological debates, mystical experiences, and the pursuit of their own inner purity.
Because if Satan can convince the people who actually care about justice to go lock themselves in a monastery and pray all day, he neutralizes his only real opposition.
Exactly.
The moral people are so busy feeling holy in their caves that they completely ignore the starving children, the corrupt politicians, and the systemic injustice happening right outside their doors.
It's a strategy of voluntary dormant status. The poem, and by extension the lecture, argues that asceticism is Satan's greatest victory because it leaves the administration of the entire material world, the economy, the courts, the military, completely uncontested and in the hands of the corrupt.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. The lecture is arguing that focusing exclusively on your own spiritual salvation while society burns down around you isn't an act of piety, it's an act of cowardice.
It is.
It's actively playing for the enemy's team.
Exactly. The intellectual audit of asceticism reveals that it is a profound failure. True religion, according to the protocol of this text, is not about finding an escape hatch from reality. It is about engaging with reality and transforming it.
Yeah.
If you spend decades polishing your own soul in isolation, but do nothing to dismantle the machinery of Takathur in your society, the lecture suggests you haven't achieved enlightenment. You've merely achieved irrelevance.
Okay, so pure materialism fails because it creates a society of hoarders that eventually collapses. Asceticism fails because it abandons the world to the hoarders. Both extremes crash when subjected to the protocol.
Yes.
So what is the path forward? If we can't worship the material world and we can't run away from it, what is the alternative model the lecture proposes?
Well, The lecture transitions here to define the concept of absolute balance. The text anchors this in an analysis of Surah 10, verse 25, which extends an invitation to humanity to enter what is called al-Salam, commonly translated as the abode of peace.
Right.
But the speaker insists that we use our intellect to drill down into the etymological roots of these Arabic terms, rather than settling for passive English translations.
Because words like peace and believer have been heavily diluted over time. They sound so passive now.
Precisely. The speaker points out that the Arabic word typically translated as believer, Momin, is derived from a root word that fundamentally means security, or to grant safety.
So a Momin isn't just someone who holds a specific set of theological beliefs in their head while sitting quietly in a pew.
No, the lecture defines a Momin as a person who actively grants security to their society. It is someone who protects human values, ensures justice, and creates a safe environment for the vulnerable.
It's an action.
It is a highly active sociological job description, not just a label of internal faith.
And the lecture does the same deep dive with the word salam, which we almost always translate simply as peace, implying, an absence of conflict or war.
The source explains that the root of salam is much more robust. It means taking something to its absolute perfection, bringing it to wholeness, or securing something from flaws and defects. It is about realizing the maximum positive potential of a system.
Therefore, Dar es Salaam, the abode of peace, isn't a sleepy, quiet village where nothing happens.
It is a dynamic state of societal perfection. It is a civilization where human potential is fully unlocked, where justice is structurally enforced, and where individuals are secure from exploitation.
Right.
And the mechanism to achieve this state is introduced by another crucial term in the lecture.
Husn.
Husn. Let's explore that. What does that mean here?
Husn translates to proportion, balance, equilibrium, or beauty. In the context of the lecture, it refers to the aesthetic and functional perfection of all things operating in their correct ratios.
Ratios like the 1/10 and 9/10? Exactly. True balance is achieving the perfect equilibrium between fulfilling our physical requirements, that 1/10 biological drive, and upholding the higher moral framework, the 9/10.
The lecture makes it clear that we are not supposed to be afraid of the physical universe.
Not at all.
The text insists that the natural forces of the world are meant to be conquered and utilized. We are supposed to split the atom, harness solar energy, build advanced medical technologies, and generate massive economic wealth. The material world is a tool,
Yes.
but Husn dictates that we must utilize those conquered forces strictly for the proportional benefit of all humanity, guided by values rather than allowing them to be captured by Takathur.
This complex relationship between material power and human values is perfectly encapsulated in what is arguably the most powerful analogy in the entire lecture. We can call it the horse analogy.
Oh, this analogy is brilliant because it clarifies the entire philosophical framework instantly. Let's build it out for everyone listening.
The lecture asks you to visualize all material power wealth, technological advancement, industrial capacity, physical health, military strength as a horse.
Okay.
The text is unambiguous. You want this horse to be as incredibly strong, fast, and well-fed as possible. Material weakness is not a virtue. You need power to effect change.
Now let's run our two failed extremes through this analogy. Extreme number one, pure materialism. How do they interact with the horse?
The pure materialist becomes entirely obsessed with the horse itself. They spend every waking hour feeding the horse, brushing its coat, building its stable out of solid gold, and accumulating more horses.
Right.
But the horse remains tied up in the stable and never actually goes anywhere. The wealth and power are hoarded for their own sake. Despite all the power generated, it is ultimately useless because it lacks a higher destination.
It's power without purpose. Now, extreme number two, asceticism. The monk who runs away from the world, what do?
The ascetic looks at the horse and sees only danger. They believe the horse represents worldly desires and corruption. They believe the horse will inherently lead them away from God. So their solution is to take out a weapon and kill the horse.
They intentionally destroy their own capacity for wealth and progress out of fear.
Yes.
But as the lecture points out, once you shoot the horse, you are stranded. You have no vehicle to travel, no power to influence society, and no resources to help anyone else. You have achieved purity through impotence.
Which brings us to the path of Husn, the path of balance. The goal, the lecture argues, is to be the rider.
The rider, you don't worship the animal and you don't slaughter it.
You master it. You cultivate the most powerful, capable horse possible. You generate wealth and technological prowess. But you sit firmly in the saddle and you use the reins, which represent your intellect, your human values, the protocol of Aquil, to steer that immense physical power toward a specific, just destination.
The material world provides the kinetic energy, but human values provide the navigation system.
Beautifully said.
I love this model because it removes the inherent guilt associated with success. You don't have to apologize for building a successful company or generating wealth, provided you are acting as the writer, using that capability to pull society toward al-Salam rather than just letting the horse run wild and trample the vulnerable.
The lecture also provides a vital clarification on the psychological motivation of the writer.
Oh, right.
When you're using your power to help others, how should you conceptualize that action? The source introduces the concept of asan, which means doing good, acting beautifully, or restoring balance.
Okay.
The speaker makes a sharp distinction between divine balance and transactional behavior.
This is where the lecture brings in the analogy of the politician's favor, which is hilariously accurate.
It is. The speaker uses a very relatable scenario. Imagine you do a significant favor for a local politician. You campaign for them, you donate money, you help get them elected.
Yeah.
Your action was entirely transactional. Right. You expect them to remember you when they're in power and return the favor.
But as the text notes, once the politician secures their position, they walk past you in the street and ignore you like a, quote, forgetful parrot.
It perfectly illustrates how human society usually operates. We do good deeds expecting a reciprocal return, and we feel betrayed when the transaction fails. The lecture argues that true asan divine balance operates on a completely different frequency. It is not transactional.
You aren't doing a good deed just to put society or God in your debt.
Exactly. The lecture frames asan as a permanent, systemic state of restoring equilibrium. When the writer uses their horse to help someone, they are simply maintaining the proper mathematical proportion of the universe.
They're balancing the scales.
Right. They're acting justly, not because they want a reward, but because acting unjustly creates a structural imbalance that will inevitably collapse the very system they live in.
That is a profound shift in motivation. It moves morality from a system of earning brownie points to a system of structural engineering.
That's a great way to put it.
You maintain the building not because the building will say thank you, but because if you don't, the roof will cave in on your head.
Which perfectly transitions us to a much darker line of inquiry in the text. The lecture poses a critical question. What happens when a society completely ignores this blueprint?
Right.
What occurs when a civilization fails to balance the horse and the rider, and instead allows the malfunction of Takathur to dictate its economic and social structures?
We've talked about the theoretical failure of materialism, but the lecture gets highly specific about the real-world consequences here. The source provides a grim, almost terrifyingly relevant warning about what happens when a society collapses under the weight of its own greed.
The speaker makes it abundantly clear that ignoring these human values does not merely result in some abstract, metaphysical demerit that you only find out about after you die.
Right, this isn't just a threat about burning in hell in the afterlife.
Not at all. The lecture argues that abandoning Husn results in immediate, tangible, geopolitical humiliation and catastrophic economic ruin in this current world.
And the lecture cites another parable from the Quran to illustrate the mechanics of this collapse.
Yes.
It describes a theoretical town or civilization that was experiencing a golden age. They were utterly secure, and wealth and abundance were pouring in from every conceivable direction. They had achieved peak material success.
But, the text notes, the leaders and citizens of this town chose to build an artificial system.
Let's define what the lecture means by an artificial system, because that sounds like a very specific term.
Within this framework, an artificial system is any societal architecture that fundamentally violates the natural balance of human values.
Okay.
Based on everything the lecture has discussed, this implies an economic system built explicitly on Takathur hoarding, extreme wealth concentration, monopolistic practices, and the intentional suppression of proportional justice. They took all the abundance flowing into the city and bottlenecked it at the very top.
And the text states that as a direct consequence of building this artificial system, the entire civilization was enveloped in what it translates as a garb of hunger and fear.
Hunger and fear, the two most primal, destabilizing forces a society can face.
I want to test the mechanics of this because it's easy to read that as ancient mysticism, like a curse fell upon them. How does the lecture explain the causality here? If a city has massive wealth pouring in, how does it end up starving and terrified?
The speaker in the lecture is adamant that this disaster was not an arbitrary punishment. It wasn't a magical lightning bolt thrown from the sky by an angry deity.
Right.
The text highlights a very specific phrase in the parable. The suffering descended upon them because of what they used to do with their own hands.
It is entirely cause and effect?
Yes. The lecture introduces the concept of the accumulative effect. Think about the literal mechanics of an economy driven by Takathur. When the hyper-wealthy hoard resources, when capital is frozen in massive accounts rather than circulating, when wages are suppressed to maximize corporate accumulation, it creates artificial scarcity.
The abundance is still physically there, but it is locked away.
Exactly.
The velocity of money drops to zero for the working class.
Right. The mathematical accumulative effect of that hoarding is extreme disparity. And what are the inevitable byproducts of extreme wealth disparity?
Well, the first is mass hunger.
Yes. The literal inability of the lower classes to afford the basic 1/10 biological necessities because the resources have been captured. And the second byproduct is mass fear.
Because when people are starving while looking at mansions, the social contract breaks.
Completely.
Fear manifests as skyrocketing crime, social unrest, violent revolutions, and aggressive policing to protect the hoarded wealth.
The garb of hunger and fear is not a curse. It is the predictable, mathematical output of an unbalanced system. It's like constructing a 70-story skyscraper but intentionally ignoring structural engineering protocols to save money on steel.
Yeah.
When the wind blows and the building collapses, you cannot blame gravity for being angry at you. Gravity was just executing its natural laws. The flaw was in your artificial design.
The universe possesses a kind of moral gravity. If you construct an economy that defies the laws of balance, the structure will eventually crush itself under its own accumulated weight.
Exactly.
The lecture is telling us that a society that abandons the protocol of intellect will successfully engineer its own hell on earth long before any theological afterlife is even discussed.
It really changes how you interpret global events, doesn't it? The lecture suggests that when we observe supply chain failures, crushing inflation, or societal fracturing, we shouldn't view them as random historical accidents.
Right.
We are witnessing the accumulative effect of artificial systems functioning exactly as their flawed blueprints dictate.
If that worldly collapse is the immediate math of our actions, how does the lecture frame the ultimate final consequence? This moves us to the final major concept explored in the text, the Day of Judgment.
Yes. The lecture analyzes Surahs 10, verses 28 through 30, which detail the gathering of humanity for a final audit. But importantly, the speaker doesn't frame this as a mystical, chaotic event. It is framed as the ultimate, inescapable exposure of the accumulative effect we just discussed.
In the material world, you can manipulate the narrative. You can build a system based on exploitation and hire a PR firm to call it innovation. You can hide the damage your artificial systems cause.
Sure.
But the lecture describes this final audit as a moment when all illusions, all marketing, and all excuses are brutally stripped away.
The true nature of what every individual and society built is exposed to total transparency. And the lecture focuses on a highly specific, dramatically charged confrontation that occurs during this exposure.
Okay.
It is a confrontation between the followers and their leaders.
The masses who participated in the artificial systems and the architects who designed them.
Exactly. The lecture provides a profound psychological study of how human beings attempt to shift blame when cornered. The text describes how the followers, the everyday people who participated in the Takathur, will turn to the leaders, the politicians, the corporate titans, the corrupt religious figures, and attempt to lay the blame entirely at their feet.
They will play the ultimate victim card. You made us do this. We just existed in the system you built. We believed your propaganda. We were just cogs in the machine. It is your fault we are facing this ruin.
But the lecture notes that the leaders will instantly, coldly deny any responsibility for the followers' actions.
Wow.
They will reply, "We didn't force you. We didn't mind control you. You followed us because it was comfortable for you.
Yeah.
You liked the crumbs the unbalanced system provided."
They throw their own followers right under the bus.
And then the leaders do something devastating to cement their defense.
Right.
The text says the leaders will tell the followers to ask the divine to bear witness, proving that the followers possessed free will the entire time.
Unbelievable.
God is a witness between us, they say. They point out that every follower had the capacity to choose differently.
The text is making it radically clear that the defense of, I was just following orders or I was just doing what society told me to do, is completely inadmissible in this final audit.
And why is it inadmissible? Because of the core theme we established at the very beginning.
The protocol.
Because you were given akal. You were issued an intellect.
Right. You are given the explicit, mandatory command to use your rational mind to verify the systems you engage with.
Yes.
If you chose to turn your brain off, if you voluntarily handed the reins of your horse to a leader who is clearly operating a system of hoarding and exploitation well, you are fully complicit.
You cannot blame the architect of the artificial system if you willingly picked up a hammer and helped them build it, especially when your own intellect was screaming that the blueprint was flawed.
You abdicated your human responsibility, and the audit simply exposes the mathematical result of what you did with your own hands.
It is a terrifying level of personal accountability. The framework of this lecture leaves absolutely zero room to hide in the crowd. However, human nature constantly tries to evade this accountability.
Oh, always.
The speaker in the 1970 lecture actually concludes with a touch of dark comedy to illustrate this evasion, using an anecdote about a preacher.
The preacher analogy. It's a brilliant observation on cognitive dissonance. The speaker describes a scene where a man is sitting in a crowded congregation listening to a fiery, terrifying sermon.
Okay.
The preacher is at the pulpit, shouting about the horrors of hell, the impending punishment for the corrupt, the fate of those who hoard wealth and oppress the poor.
The preacher's vividly describing the consequences of failing the audit.
Right. But the man sitting in the audience isn't trembling. He is actually chuckling to himself. He finds the whole thing mildly amusing.
Which is a deeply unnatural reaction to a threat of cosmic punishment.
Totally. So someone leans over and asks him, "Why are you laughing?" And the man reveals his mindset. Throughout the entire terrifying sermon, he was completely, unshakably convinced that the preacher was talking about other people.
Hell is always for someone else.
Exactly. Hell is for the corrupt politicians on the news. Hell is for the greedy billionaires. Hell is for the criminals.
Yeah.
The man in the audience assumes that because he goes to the right building once a week, or because he wears the right religious label, he has a VIP pass that exempts him from the rules of cause and effect.
It is the ultimate delusion. The lecture warns that the universe does not care about your tribal affiliations, your self-assigned labels, or your internal feelings of piety. The universe only recognizes the accumulative effect of your actions.
If you participate in an artificial system based on greed, you will receive the garb of hunger and fear. If you refuse to use your intellect to audit your reality, you will fail the final audit, regardless of what team you think you play for.
It is a system of absolute mathematical justice.
Well, we have traversed a massive amount of philosophical and sociological ground in this hour.
We really have.
Let's pull the threads together. We started by looking at a 1970 lecture that dismantled two massive assumptions about humanity. We established that we are not born inherently evil, nor are we merely biological machines meant to blindly follow the laws of the jungle.
Right.
Our biological drives, the pursuit of survival, represent only 1/10 of our existence.
The other 9/10 constitute our capacity for values, justice, and Husn balance. Without the active application of those values, we drop below the animal baseline due to the malfunction of Takathur, the infinite cancerous hunger for endless accumulation.
We saw how pure materialism accelerates this hoarding, and how asceticism cowardly surrenders the world to the hoarders. The lecture demanded we reject both extremes. We cannot worship the horse, and we cannot shoot the horse.
We must become the rider.
Yes. Holding the reins of our values to guide material progress toward al-Salam.
And we learned that if we fail to act as the rider, the artificial systems we build will naturally crush us, creating a worldly hell of hunger and fear long before any final audit.
And when that final audit arrives, the protocol of intellect ensures we will have no one to blame but ourselves.
Yeah.
We talked at the very beginning about how approaching ancient texts often feels like being asked to put on a blindfold.
Just blind faith.
Right. But the lecture we explored today does the exact opposite. It hands you a brilliantly illuminated X-ray of human society and demands that you read the scans yourself.
It really does.
But there is a catch to this framework. Once you accept that the universe demands peer review, once you turn that X-ray machine on and engage your intellect, you forever strip away the comforting excuse of ignorance.
Absolutely.
You can no longer blame your biology, your politicians, or your society for the state of the world because you were given the tools to audit them. You have the intellect. You hold the reins. So the ultimate question the text leaves you with is, what kind of system are you building with your own two hands today?